served as an executive of Microsoft Corporation and oversaw the development and marketing of Microsoft Access and Microsoft Investor. Then served as Amazon's first senior vice president for U.S. retail, where he helped grow the company from a small bookstore into the world's largest internet retailer. He is a Draper Richards Kaplan social entrepreneur and a Microsoft Alumni Integral Fellow, and serves on the advisory board of Barcelona's ESADE Business School. I hope I said that right. So let's give David a warm welcome.
Well, hello, everyone. I said hello, everyone. Hello. There we go. There we go. It's great to be here. It's great to be here. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Barish. Thank you, Anton. Wonderful to invite me here. At World Reader, we want to create a world where every child has the books she needs to improve her life. So that's what we're trying to do. And we're using devices that look like this, and we're using devices that look like cell phones, mobile phones. That's what we want to do, because eventually we want to eradicate illiteracy. And so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the path of how I got there, and actually take us all on kind of two journeys at the same time. So the first journey is one that starts in South America, goes up through Seattle, goes over through Barcelona, and kind of ends up down in Africa. The second journey looks like this, and I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. So the story that I want to begin with started about 4 years ago, and it's a little hard to see this slide, but what this is a picture of me and my family and in an orphanage in Guayaquil, Ecuador. So my family and I, about 4 years ago, decided to spend the entire year traveling around the world. And we went to China, we went to Vietnam, we went to Australia, we went all over the place. And we were actually our teachers. We were teachers to our own to our kids. And at the end of the trip, we spent about 2 or 3 weeks all right, in Ecuador. And in Ecuador, we visited an orphanage. This orphanage is called Perpetuo Socorro, an orphanage there, a girls' orphanage. And we spent the day giving out towels and school supplies and so forth and so on, and working with these girls. And you'll see me in the upper right-hand corner there. That was back when I had more hair than I have today. And my daughters are there as well. My wife is there as well. And then the rest are the girls in the orphanage. And at the end of the day, as we were kind of heading out the door, I looked and I saw across the way a building with a big padlock on it. I asked the woman who ran the orphanage, what's going on? And she said, well, that is our library. And I said, well, why is it all locked up? And she said, well, here's how it goes. The books in the library take forever to get here. Right? They come by ship. They take months and months to get here. Sometimes by the time they arrive, they're not really even the books we wanted anymore. Sometimes they were never the books we really wanted. You know, it's the Encyclopedia Britannica from 1972. You know, these types of things, the sorts of books that nobody else wanted. And so they come and they arrive and they get put in this room, and then the kids read them. And now they're done. You know, the kids have read all the books in the library that they're interested in. And so I said, well, okay, that's sort of an interesting story. Can I have a look inside? And she looked at me and she said, David, I think I may have lost the key. So this for me was kind of a big moment, because you have to understand, when I was growing up, the only way I really had of exploring the world was through books. You know, my mom, I grew up in Maryland. My mom in Bethesda, Maryland would drop me off you know, on Sunday morning or Saturday morning when she'd go to the grocery store. She'd drop my brother and me off at the library, and she'd head off to Giant Foods. And we'd come home with a big old stack of books, and that's what we did every single weekend. We would read the books, and we'd come back, and then we'd read them again. You know, read the next set the next week. And so that was kind of my life growing up. And in fact, you know, as I sort of look back through my life, you know, I was a comparative literature major in college. I'll tell you about how I left Microsoft in a second, but I went to join this tiny little company called Amazon, which was at the time was just a bookstore. So books had sort of been this theme of my life. And I'm thinking to myself, this is crazy. Like, we don't need to live in a world anymore where you have to cut trees down and pulp them up and turn them into paper and ship those things halfway around the world and then put them in a room. Like, that's nuts. That's the old way, and that way worked for 600 years. But today, you know, anywhere you can get a cell phone call, you should be able to get a book. So that was kind of the thought that began to occur to me as I'm standing here in this orphanage in Ecuador. But then, I started to go through kind of a deeper thought process of, well, hold on. I've been very lucky in my life. I worked at Microsoft for many years. I worked at Amazon for many years. I can do all sorts of things right now. Do I want to dedicate my life to really trying to solve this problem? And to sort of work my way through that thought process, I thought back to some other big decisions that I had made in my life. And this was one of them. So this kindly gentleman you're looking at on the screen, he looks like a nice enough guy. But the last time I had seen him was when he called me to his office. So I've been working at Microsoft from 1991 to 1997. And in 1996, I got a phone call from this crazy guy named Jeff Bezos, and we sort of got to know each other. And Jeff said, you know what, I think it'd be a good idea, David, for you to come and apply for a job here at Amazon. And so I applied for a job, and I got a job as a vice president of marketing. And so I went into Bill Gates' office, and I said, Bill called me up actually. He said, David, I need you to come to my office right now. I said, okay. And so I went to his office, and he said, look, David, you mean to tell me you are going to leave Microsoft? You are going to go work for some tiny little, internet bookstore that no one has ever heard of. This is in 1996. That has got to be one of the stupidest decisions I have ever heard in my entire life. And I'm like, whoa. But I realized it was what I needed to do. This was, as I say, back in 96. I had done my work at Microsoft for many years, and books were sort of my thing. And the idea of running a bookstore was incredibly appealing. And so I realized as I sort of started to think back, I have made hard decisions in the past. And frankly, I've often taken the path towards books. And I can't exactly explain why. And so then I thought more deeply about it. And I realized, well, hold on, I actually do know the reason why. This was my mother, and there I am when I was 4 years old. And this was my childhood growing up. I mean, I literally would walk to school reading books, and my neighbors would call my mom and say, look, your son is going to get run over, right? And so the reason I'm kind of dwelling on this is because the world of social enterprise is not easy. The problems we solve are big. And so you really need to tap into something that's very, very deep in yourself in order to jump out of bed in the morning and to be excited about attacking these big, big, big problems. So I went through this thought process, and I realized that, I've got some skills that I accumulated at Microsoft. I got some skills I accumulated at Amazon. I mean, when I joined Amazon, it was a tiny little company, $16 million in sales, $15.8 million in sales, actually. So its first full year of operation in 1996. Jeff Bezos' vision was and is, I want to create the place where you can find and discover anything you want to buy online. That's $1 billion vision, right? And he said to me, David, look, if we do this right, we might be $1 billion in sales by the year 2000, which sounded like a crazy and audacious thing, but we got to $1 billion and far beyond by the time I left. So I had some skills and some things I'd learned in that journey. And then I had some real passion around books and around getting books into kids' hands. And so I thought, okay, this is in fact what I really want to dedicate my life to now. Okay, so once you make a decision like that, then the hard part begins. Well, okay, that was hard. But then the next hard part begins, which is, well, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to actually get this thing done? And really one of the first things I did is I called up some old friends at Amazon. So the people who ran the Kindle store, one thing I neglected to mention is that my two daughters were reading. We had been spending all this time traveling, and each of them had a Kindle to read sort of the school books and the books as we were reading along. So I knew quite a lot about this product. And in fact, I also knew the guy who runs the Kindle store, a guy named Steve Kessel, who in fact graduated from GSB some 15 years ago. Anyway, I had recruited him into Amazon years ago. And so I called Steve, and I said, look, Steve, I've got this idea, and this idea is let's stop shipping physical books to the developing world, because that kind of isn't really working. The infrastructure is bad, the roads are bad. There's a reason why, entire countries like India have decided, look, I'm going to base my economy on a service economy, not a physical goods economy, because service economy's infrastructure is a lot lighter weight, and I can actually, therefore, play in the world economy. So that fact is going to be replicated over and over again in the developing world. You've got poor infrastructure, but the digital world, it's a lot easier to move bits around the world than atoms, and so the digital world is going to become even more important in the developing world than it is in the developed world. Let's figure out a way to get books into kids' hands using the same kind of sea change. So I said, Steve, can you donate some Kindles to me to get started? And I want to start in Africa because at the time I was living in Europe and I was close to Africa and all sorts of reasons. I'll come to that afterwards if you're interested. But he said, David, here's the problem. I don't really have a line item in my budget called, send a bunch of free Kindles to David so he can start this thing called World Reader. But we went back and forth on it, and after a couple of months, he said, okay, we can find about 30 Kindles to get you guys started, just to sort of, kind of see whether this thing goes anywhere. And then you're going to have to start buying them. I said, I understand that. And we'll come back to that theme too. In fact, if you have questions about that, I'd love to answer them about sort of how nonprofits and for-profits can work together. Anyway, that was sort of step one. Step two involved doing some research. And I found that in sub-Saharan Africa alone, there are 200 million kids who have no books. And really, I mean no books. I'm talking about waking up every morning and living in a house where there's literally not a single book, or maybe there's a Bible, or maybe there's a Quran, and probably not much else. And then going to school, in a school with textbooks that you have to share, one to every 40 or 50 people. So effectively living in a world with no books at all. So, okay, now I've got some skills, I've got some passion, I've got a little bit of knowledge, and now let's sort of pause here and just stare at this, because I also have a problem that I really, really want to solve, which is this problem. So it's one thing to talk about 200 million kids. It's another thing to see one of these children. This is a picture we took in Ghana. She's in a library. The library is a delightful building. It's got shelves, it's got tables, but obviously it's missing one thing. That's the problem we're trying to solve. The way we're going to solve it is digitally. And now let's talk about how we're doing that. So we decided to start in Ghana. This was, a combination of some strategy and, frankly, a fair amount of luck. I had met a woman who used to run orphanages in Ghana and had decided to turn those buildings over to the government to be used as schools because she sort of pivoted her aid strategy. And so as a result, she had schools which she had kind of developed along with the government and then turned over to the government, and they were now using. And therefore she said, look, come down to Ghana. I can introduce you to, we can do a little pilot here, and I can introduce you to the Minister of Education and so on. So we did. So this is literally the first village we ever did a pilot in. This is in 2010, a village of Ionia Ghana. Very, very rudimentary, as you can see. They do have running water, but not much. There's no electricity in the town except for the electricity that runs the cell phone tower. So there is cell phone coverage there. Ghana, like much of sub-Saharan Africa, has roughly 80% cell phone penetration. And you can think of that either in population terms or in geography terms. It's about equal. Anyway, so here's Ionia Ghana, very, very rudimentary village where we started. And this is the school that we started. It's a primary school. And it is actually a fairly kind of well-appointed school. There's no electricity in the school itself, but the school has access to power through that wind, and there's also some solar as well. And you can see in the background there are actually quite a few books here, which is very unusual, but they have kind of a private donor that's been helping them over the years. But I will tell you that when we first walked into this classroom in Ghana, I picked up one of the books off the shelf, and the first book I picked up was called The History of Utah. And that's, again, part of the problem that we're trying to solve, right? Is that a lot of the books that have made it to the developing world over the years are not the books that kids are going to be interested in, are not the books that are fundamentally going to allow people to change their lives. They're the books that nobody else wanted. And this is just sort of an artifact of, of kind of physical world, shipping. Anyway, so that's the first trial we did. You're literally watching kids here, read their first books on the e-reader, on the Kindle. Honestly, it was very easy for them. Again, with such high cell phone penetration, it's not hard to get kids to pick up a little device and flip pages. That turns out to be, very straightforward. And one of the most amazing things was talking to the kids after they were finished, and they would look at me and they would say, David, can we have another? And we would say, yeah, you can have another. And 60 seconds later, they would be reading, the next book in the Curious George series, which is the series that we had on these books. And that is sort of this mind-blowing moment, right? Where all of a sudden you move from, it's going to take me 6 months and maybe the right books are going to come, to in 60 seconds I can get the books I need to improve my life, or in this case, the books I need just to read, just to practice my reading and to practice my English. So that was the first trial. And at that point, we were dealing with a very small number of kids, about 20 children, 20 students in one country, with about 160 ebooks. Each one of the e-readers, of course, can hold thousands of books. We put sort of 8-ish books per e-reader to sort of get things started, and to kind of see whether it would work. And that was, we sort of thought of that as the proof of concept stage. And very quickly, over the course of about a week, which was how long that trial lasted, it proved that it was very clear these kids wanted to read more if they could actually get their hands on the books, and we could deliver the books into their hands. The next sort of step along this journey was to the Ministry of Education. One of the big kind of meta issues that you always have when you're a social enterprise or a nonprofit is, how are you going to engage with the governments of countries? And we decided very early on that we wanted to be a partner with the government to the extent that that made sense. And so we spent some time with the Ministry of Education and kind of got their approval to expand this project in Ghana. We got their approval to expand it to 6 schools and to run kind of a year-long study to see what the effect is. And the questions we really wanted to answer were, do the kids read more, and do the kids read better? And now, 3 years into it, we actually have a lot of data about that, which again I can share a little later in the presentation. So now, we have a bigger problem. Now we have to start raising money, so we start doing that. Again, I can tell you stories about that later if you're interested. This was, bless you, this was the first shipment of Kindles that we purchased from Amazon. We actually purchased them at a bit of a discount. Crazy logistical thing had to happen in order to make this. So this is literally about 500 Kindles, all shrink wrapped, that had to make their way actually from the UK, because they'd run out of stock in the US of this number. This was around Thanksgiving of 2010. Anyway, they shipped them to us through this crazy arrangement of British Airways offloading some freight and unloading some other. Anyway, insane stuff. By the way, I actually put this shipment on my credit card, and I still remember American Express calling me up one night while I'm eating dinner, and they said, is this Mr. Risher? Yeah. And Amazon.com has been charging your credit card $2,700 every 30 seconds, and they've been doing it for the last hour and a half. Is that okay? And I said, yeah, that's fine. That's kind of part of the arrangement here. So they had to break it up into smaller units. It's crazy. They didn't really. Amazon now is a better business to business kind of organization, but at the time we were one of the biggest purchasers of Kindles they'd ever had. So that, and I should say one other thing. This shipment was actually so large that the Joseph Botway, who we had hired to be our kind of representative in Ghana, it was so big that he actually couldn't fit it in his house, and so we hired about 6 of his friends, or just volunteers actually, to come, and they spent the entire night sleeping outside this truck to make sure that no one took this. So you end up it's like any small business. You end up doing crazy things to sort of make it all work, particularly up front. This is what the setup looked like early on. This was actually a private school in Ghana, in Accra, Ghana. And this is their computer lab. It's Thanksgiving Day of 2010. And there I am, and there's some of the folks who work at the school, and there's a guy named Zev over in the corner who works for World Readers still to this day. And the reason we were doing this on Thanksgiving, by the way, is because it was an international school, and so the school itself was closed, so they said you can use our computer lab for free. So that's the setup that we started to do, where we started to download hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, ultimately thousands of books, onto each one of the Kindles. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those books in a couple of minutes. This is what it looked sort of midway through the day. This is what it looked like later that same day as things started to get a little bit ragged. And and it took us probably till 2 in the morning or so to kind of get all the e-readers set up. This is that guy Zev I just pointed out. That's what about 300 e-readers looks like after they've been set up, and we'd labeled each one of them and so forth. So again, very frankly manual work. But then it was done. Then we had we'd already chosen 6 schools. We were going to be in those schools for about the next year. And then the next thing we needed to do, and this literally was the next morning, is we had arranged a large community meeting. Okay, so another thing you learn very quickly in the world of social enterprise is your impact is never just on the people you think it is. If you're dealing with students and children, of course, inevitably you're going to have an impact. You're going to have an enormous effect on the broader community. And you want the broader community to be bought into what you're doing, right? You want them to have a deep understanding of what it is you're doing so that they can support it. Because here we're trying to do something quite new, right? We're trying to create almost a culture of reading in a part of the world that's really not been able to develop that in the past. So this was one of our early church events. We literally would bring people into a church on a Sunday morning and kind of tell them about the program, and we had some of the students kind of stand up and talk about the importance of reading. This is actually one of the village chiefs who stood up right at the beginning. That's Joseph on the left, by the way. He works with World Reader. That's Colin on the right. He also works with World Reader. He's actually my co-founder, although at the time he was kind of in a different role. And that's one of the village chiefs in the middle. And he said something horrifying after kind of at the end of a sort of sermon. He said, look, we have this terrible saying in Ghana, which is if you want to hide money from the black man in Africa, you put it in a book because he will never find it there. That is the problem you guys are going to solve for us. That was another one of our sort of big moments where we all really came to understand kind of the importance of what we were doing. So now here's what it looks like in the classroom. This was literally our first day that we started in one of these 6 schools. We have the e-readers. Those are now the sort of third generation of e-readers. We also got a donation from a company called M-Edge, which produces these cases, which we put around the e-readers. Later, and even still today, they donate lights to us so that the kids can read after the sun goes down. Super important. And this was just an amazing moment. This was kind of where it all began to kind of come together at a much bigger scale. Now we're talking about hundreds of kids instead of tens of kids. And their reading was absolutely ferocious. Once again, there is no shortage of curiosity in the world. What there's a shortage of is books and reading material, and that's a problem that that we are solving. This picture here, we actually took a couple of hours after the launch of the program. We'd launched the program in 3 of the schools, and we went out for to have some lunch. And these were kids that we saw in the market that first day. So they literally, and we encouraged the teachers to let the kids take their e-readers home with them and read at home. And these were kids who were literally reading with each other. This is a picture that Colin and I took together, reading to each other in a market. And that's the sort of thing, we'll come to sort of metrics and how do we measure success in a couple of minutes. But honestly, at a very personal level, that's the sort of thing that kind of gets all of us out of bed in the morning. So far, the journey has just really been in Ghana, which is where we started. Today, we actually are in 3,600 kids' hands in Ghana. We're also in Kenya. We've expanded it to Uganda as well. This is just over the course of 3 years. Into Rwanda as well, with a partnership project I'll tell you about in a couple of moments. We're in Tanzania. Again, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a couple of seconds, with over 1,000 kids. We're in South Africa. We're in Zambia. We're in Zimbabwe. And we just started about 3 weeks ago our newest project in Malawi. So this is scaling. Melanie mentioned this word a little while ago, right? I mean, we start from an idea. We start from a single geography. And very quickly, over the course of 3 years, we've expanded all across the continent of Africa with e-reader programs in each of these countries. In total now, I guess I can use this. We have 12,000 children reading on e-readers every day, and they have a total of 700,000 books in their hands, which is just a staggering number, something we could never have done if we tried to do it all physically, but of course we can do so much of it digitally. And the impact has been absolutely enormous. And I want to try to describe that in a little bit more detail, because this is one of the sort of fundamental questions that everyone needs to sort of grapple with, is how do you measure the impact of the programs you're doing? We have now a system, and it's a fairly well-developed system that we've used both in Kenya and in Ghana, called EGRA. That's Early Grade Reading Assessment, where we literally look at the number of sounds, letter sounds, and made-up words, and then real words that a child can read over the course of a minute. And we measure their progress over the course of a school term. And so, for example, one of the little tests we give is we ask children to identify the sound of a letter. So, all right, everyone, take a look at the letter on the screen. What sound does that letter make, please? That's very good. Can you say it again? That's very good. That's exactly it. That's the sound of the letter K. So, by the way, everyone knows how to say K, but funnily enough, it's not always obvious that you can go from the letter K to the sound K. And that's one of the sort of early indicators when you can do that over all 26 sounds of the alphabet, or 26 letters of the alphabet, that you're going to be a reader. Here's a made-up word. What is this word, please? There we go. Exactly right. So, and these sorts of things. So we've got a string of these little 3-letter words, and we ask the children to read them. And that we use a sort of standard assessment to decide whether they've read them correctly or incorrectly. We mark them off on a little tablet, and that's kind of one of the ways that we assess reading skills. This is one of the measurements we did, actually another organization did on our behalf that's funded by USAID. And they were, in this case, comparing our program, the e-reader program, to that of the control schools, and then to 2 different tablet-based interventions. And this is literally just measuring the number of properly pronounced words over the course of 60 seconds that children read. These are very young children, by the way. These are second graders, first graders. And they started with reading about 6.3 words correctly a minute, and now they read about 14.2 words a minute. It's actually not start to end. It's in the control schools, they read about 6.3. In our schools, they read about 14.2. So very, very significant difference over the course of just about 3 months or so. This was a project we did in Kenya. So that's sort of where we are on the e-reader side of our work. This is a project, again, in Kenya that's going on. But one of the other things we realized early on is we don't just want to use a single platform, right? So like any organization, you want to figure out how can you scale up to the size of really your ambitions or the problem you're trying to solve. And so about a year ago, we decided to expand our platform beyond just using e-readers to also make use of feature phones. Feature phones are inexpensive phones. They're sort of $50 phones. They're sort of the most common phones in most of the developing world. Typically, they've got a web browser and not much else, right? So they're certainly not smartphones. They're nothing like the Android phone or the iPhone that most of us are familiar with today. But they're very capable phones in the sense that they have data connectivity. And if they can get a web screen, they can read a book. And so we now have an app that is on about 3 million feature phones. It's got about 300,000 unique users every month. Again, this is from zero about 18 months ago. And they read an average of about 40 pages a month. And what are well, first of all, where are people reading? They're reading all across sub-Saharan Africa, but they're also reading in India. They're also reading in Pakistan. They're reading in Bangladesh. They're reading in Nepal. They're reading in Brazil. These are the actual numbers. This is just our dashboard that we look at every day, where these are monthly statistics at the end of August. We're looking at the total number of users. So those are people who've read at least one page. And then the total number of page views. And if you do the math, it's anywhere from 30 to 60 page views over the course of a month, all on their feature phones. Which is, just, again, sort of extraordinary growth from zero about 18 months ago when we started this program. And what are they reading? Here are some of the books, and again, the total number of users. This is over a couple or 3-month period. There's Can Love Happen Twice? Romance is big, 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 big. People love romance everywhere. The Girl with the Magic Hands. Abandoned, that's other romance. It's a love story, right? And then there's the Quran. There's Kwame Nkrumah, the great African. And then there is How to Write a CV, Resume, and Cover Letter, and Tips for Job Interviews, right? And then Are You Ready for Sex, right? So that gives you a sense of the types of things that people read. And it turns out if you look at what people search for, I know it's a little bit hard to read, but there's term number 1, sex, far and away, right? Always, everywhere. Bible number 2, biology number 3, and Things Fall Apart, which is one of Africa's most famous novels by a Nigerian author. Number 4. And then love, dictionary, physics, chemistry. It gives you a very, very deep sense of the types of things that people are interested in reading more about. Oh, and there's Harry Potter, too. It's so fantastic. You see sex, you see Harry Potter, and you see chemistry all in the same list. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit more about the books, because this is a sort of piece that I haven't talked too much about. One of the things we realized early on is it's not really the right call to just go ahead and bring a bunch of books from the United States, digitize them, and put them onto books put them onto e-readers for the developing world. That's interesting, but frankly, it's not really the most impactful. The most impactful is figuring out a way to digitize the local textbooks and storybooks in the cultures where we are operating. And so all of these books, these are Ghanaian and Kenyan textbooks that we've digitized ourselves that are in the program. Then Ghanaian and Kenyan and Tanzanian, in this case, storybooks as well, right? And some of these books, like Visit to the Orphanage or Mother's Tribute or 12 Great Anansi Stories, that's a great example. 12 Great Anansi Stories, that's a story, there's a series of stories from Ghana. It's about Anansi the Magic Spider. And when you read these sorts of stories, we have a story called Kofi Goes to the Beach, you know, and it's about a little kid named Kofi. He gets up in the morning, he leaves Accra, which is the capital of Ghana. He goes to the beach, he eats fufu with his mother, which is one of the foods of Ghana, right? So this type of thing, it's the same story that you and I might read here in the United States, except instead of, you know, David leaving, you know, San Francisco and going to the beach, it's Kofi going to the beach. And therefore it's much, much more approachable to kids in the developing world. Of course, when you're reading about your own culture, you tend to be much, much more engaged. When you're reading your own textbook, you tend to be much more engaged, of course. And in fact, it makes the teachers much more comfortable using the e-readers in their classroom. We've also worked with international publishers. The Magic Treehouse series is very popular. And these books, we get donated for free. And if you sort of think about it, the sales of the Magic Treehouse series or the Nancy Drew series or Hardy Boys in the developing world are quite small. And therefore, we can go to publishers and we can say, look, can you give us the rights to use these for free? Because they're not going to cannibalize your existing book sales. And they'll create a new generation of readers. And after a little back and forth, they typically say yes. So we end up putting a combination of local books, local textbooks, local storybooks, as well as international storybooks, as well as reference books like Where There Is No Doctor, The World Atlas, and then again some international storybooks, and then even books in local languages. So we have now books in English, of course, but also in Kiswahili, in Kinyarwanda, in Twi. We have a library of in total, about 5,000 books across 10 different languages that are both local languages as well as English. Okay. I want to introduce you, as we sort of come to the end of this first part of the story, to three different people in the program. To three people, and kind of let you get a bit of a better sense of the impact that we're having. The first is a girl named Okata Kate. Now, Okata Kate, when we go to Africa, one of the first questions we always ask is, how many books have you read? And some people might raise their hands and say, well, I've read, 10 books over the last couple of months. Someone else might raise his hand and say, I've read 20 books over the last couple of months. Well, one of the last, actually 3 times ago, I went to Ghana. I asked the question, and everybody said, ask Okata Kate. And so she's kind of a shy girl, and she raises her hand, and I say, Okata Kate, how many books have you read in the last 6 months in the program? And she said, I've read 100 books. So her stated goal is to be the most famous writer in the world. That's what she wants to be. And this, what I've put up here, and she's very inspired by some of the books. There's a book called The Shark, which is a book that takes place in Ghana. And she said, this book by Pego Pong was a real inspiration to me. And once I read that book, I knew I wanted to write as well as she did, and I now want to be the most famous writer in the world. This is some of the poetry that Okata Kate has written, and it's difficult. It's difficult. I'll read you just the first couple of lines. It's called Agony of a Woman. I am the subject everyone talks about. I am a laughingstock everywhere I go. I am despised by men. Women gossip about me. Children mock me. Barren woman, they call me. They call me a witch. They say I ate my children. They say my womb is blocked. Barren woman, they call me. So this is, of course, a story or a poem about a woman who can't have children. And what you realize when you meet girls like this is they are every bit as passionate, every bit as curious as any other child you've ever met. Again, it's just in so many ways they've been held back by not having access to their own books or to the books of the world. That, again, is the problem that we're trying to solve. I want to take you across Africa now. That was in Ghana. This picture is a picture in Kenya. This is Nairobi. Well, so this is actually the Kibera slums of Nairobi. So the Kibera slums are now the largest slums in all of Africa. It is an incredible place. This was a picture, we just took this maybe 3 months ago or so. And you'll notice a couple things about it. First of all, it's actually a very, I mean, you think of a slum as sort of being this place that's full of chaos, and it sort of is, but it's sort of not. I mean, it's very well organized. There are about 1 million people who live in this slum, right in the center of Nairobi, the capital of Kenya. You'll also see that there is a cell phone tower right in the middle of it. And we have a program there at the Kibera Girls Soccer Academy. The Kibera Girls Soccer Academy was started about 5 years ago or so. It was started literally as a sports academy, but has now become quite a well-regarded school. And they have one of our programs, a World Reader program, that's now been in operation for about 6 months, with about 100 e-readers. There are about 130 girls in the school. And one of our donors just a couple of weeks ago, actually, I think just yesterday, I got the final facts, has just sort of re-upped to put another, we call them World Reader Kit, but another 50 e-readers into their hands. So really exciting here, and they're incredibly enthusiastic readers and users of our material. And I want to introduce you to Doris, and I actually have a video here which we'll play for a couple seconds, and you can kind of hear her talk a little bit about what reading means to her. That is actually a video that we made out of the footage from our last trip to Kenya. And I just found out a couple of days ago, we've been working with the folks at Amazon. They're actually going to put that video on their homepage in about 2 weeks' time, which is very exciting for us. Very exciting for us. That's critical. Last person I want you to meet is the Prime Minister of Tanzania. So at that same trip where we went to Kenya, we launched a program in Tanzania. And that's the Prime Minister Penda. And he, at the end of the day, he helped us launch 2 of our programs there. And at the end of the day, he had this to say. He said, we can afford an e-reader program. What we cannot afford is another generation of illiterate children. And this, of course, it's music to our ears. And it's the sort of really kind of enlightened thinking that so many leaders now in the developing world have, really quite different even from a generation ago. Okay. I said I'd take us on two journeys. The first one, again, the one that started in South America, kind of went spiritually through Seattle, through my friends at Amazon, through Europe, where I was living at the time, and into Africa. But the second, and the one I maybe want to leave you with, is a journey from success, and the success that I've been lucky enough to have in my life, to significance, which is, I think, something much deeper and much bigger. And this is the sort of journey that I think at some level all of us want to take in our lives, right? I mean, we all, of course, we want to work hard, we want to do well, and maybe we want to make some money, and we want to be able to pay off our student loans, and then we want to make some more money and buy some stuff, and so on and so forth, start a family, and these sort of the journey through life. But at a certain point, you think to yourself, well, hold on, you know, maybe there's something more, and this is kind of the more that I'm really very, very focused on. This guy who we saw before, of course, he's very famously made a transition from being the CEO of a very successful company to doing something different in his life. And what's interesting to me about him, and he's quite an inspiration to me, is I said before, he was quite skeptical of my leaving Microsoft to go to Amazon, but it's really been kind of quite a path that's worked, you know, that's worked out very, very well. And he ended up last year giving an award to World Reader through the Gates Foundation for our social enterprise. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, we found that we've just, after a grant application, just received a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to start working in libraries in Kenya, which we're very, very pleased about. And it's nice to see this kind of come full circle, and nice to be able to be working with Bill again. So I will finish up really just with one last picture. And this is a picture of one of the girls. Her name is Namayak in our program. She's in Kenya. And what I love about this picture and what it symbolizes for me is the fact that she is reading to her elders. You know, I grew up with my mother reading to me, and of course I read to my own children, or at least I did when they were younger. You know, much of the generation in the developing world, frankly, their parents can't read to them. Their parents are not literate, but this next generation can be literate. This is what we can do for this next generation of children, is that they can have the books they need to improve their lives and really make the world a better place. So I was asked to speak for about 45 minutes. I'm just a couple of minutes over. But I will finish here. I will take a little pause. I will put that up there so you can continue to follow us. And I'll say thank you to all of you. And now let's open it up for questions and comments. But thank you so much for your attention. I'll call on people. I'll kind of move from left to right and then kind of back, and then we'll just go for it. Yeah, I saw you first.
So thanks for an awesome talk, first of all. So how do you keep a community bought into the project after you guys leave the community? How do you make sure that you're not imposing a solution that's a long-term solution?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question was, how do you keep people involved after we've left? And I would say there are, I'll sort of point out three mechanisms, and then I will admit that it's something that we will probably work on forever. I don't think this is a question that has an answer and then you sort of are done. I think it's a question that is sort of a process. So the first thing is we work very, very closely with local community partners right from the start. You know, we have a program called the World Reader Kit, which really allows local communities to effectively buy our product and put it into their community, but they're the ones doing the implementation. It's not us. So in some cases, in some of our earliest programs, we do the implementation from end to end. But in many of our programs, many of the ones I showed up there on the map, those are actually, the implementation partner is a local partner that has a long-term investment here. I mean, they want to see this program work. Often it's a local school or a local church or a local community group that has long since decided that they want to be, that they want their community to be literate and to sort of move forward. So part of it is a partnership answer. Another answer to the question is we continually go out and get new books for the program. And so that kind of keeps the, you know, it keeps the thing fresh. It keeps it kind of interesting. And the marketer in me, you know, from my Amazon days knows you have to do, you've got to use all the tricks to keep people involved and to get people to change their behaviors. So we have to keep adding new books to the program. And so we do that. And we work with the local community to make sure that those books get downloaded onto the e-readers. And they can also, in many cases, download themselves because they've got cell phone coverage. We also, this is sort of, it sounds like a bit of a strange thing, but we have partnerships with other organizations that the people in the community really, really respect. So an example is, I've mentioned a couple of times Barcelona, where I used to live. So the Football Club of Barcelona is probably the best known soccer team, football team in the world. And certainly when you go to much of the developing world, certainly when you go to sub-Saharan Africa, the afternoon comes along and half the kids, certainly the boys, rip their shirts off at the end of school and put on a Barca football jersey and then go out and play soccer, play football. And so we worked with the FC Barcelona, and we have images of their players, which we've now put on the e-readers, saying things like, every book is a goal. Now, why do I talk about this? Because we put those on about 6 months into the program in Ghana. And so we're continually refreshing the product itself, right? Trying to keep it relevant, trying to keep it interesting, and trying to sort of tap into people's passions. Maybe their passion isn't reading a book on chemistry, but maybe their passion is football. Well, gosh, if we can put pictures and information about Lionel Messi on the e-reader, that's going to kind of keep them engaged. So that's sort of the kind of the flip side. So there's kind of an implementation side of it, working with local partners, and then there is frankly, it's sort of a marketing side. And I think you kind of have to think, as a social entrepreneur, you have to think as a marketer and think, how do you make sure that the people that you're hoping to impact, really will continue to use your product. And we also work with schools. We do some other things at sort of a more macro level, but that gives you kind of a sense of it. Yeah. I'm going to move my way around here, and then I'll kind of swing my way back. Yeah.
Where does a lot of your funding come from? I know that you mentioned the Gates grant, and kind of like, could you walk through that process a little bit? Because I know it's very long and difficult. But...
Oh my God, yeah. So yes. So the question is, where does our funding come from? And your observation was, it can be long and difficult to get grants, and that is a true statement. So our funding, let's go to the whiteboard. So, and let us, if you don't mind, I'm going to erase this part. And I will tell you right now, you do not want me on your Pictionary team because I'm an awful drawer, but I will try to do sort of pie charts on the fly here. So roughly half of our funding comes from individuals, right? So an individual funding, those are, the majority of that are, let's say, major donors, kind of either high net worth individuals or people who can make, let's say, $1,000 or more sort of donation. And that's not entirely the case. There's some segment of that is grassroots funding that comes from, $10 donations, $20 donations, and so forth. But when you're sort of getting started, at least what we did is we went to people who had big capacity and we asked them to give and give big. And in fact, I just did a fundraiser last week where we raised at that fundraiser about $250,000. So that's, and it's a big part of the job of being the president of a nonprofit. At different times of the year, the grassroots funding gets bigger and smaller, particularly around the fourth quarter of the year. That can get bigger. And that's an area where we obviously want to expand it over time for all the obvious reasons. Okay, so that's, let's say, half of it. So then of the other half, you might say that roughly, well, that's not quite right. Let's do it about a third. So of the other half, roughly a third comes from grants. And those might be foundation grants, like from the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. So I think later in this semester, Jenny Schilling-Stein is going to be a speaker here, if I'm not mistaken. Right. So Jenny is one of our board members, and she's on the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, and they have a very structured program, which I'm sure she'll tell you all about, that involves, $300,000 grants that last over 3 years, and they have a very sort of strong process around it. Anyway, those sorts of private foundation grants are quite important, and the Gates Foundation grant would fall in that same category. This sort of third of the half, so I guess that's a sixth, comes from government money. So I mentioned in passing USAID. USAID is the government, the U.S. bilateral organization that funds, that's an aid organization, right? And so they've given us a couple of different grants of various different types. And then the last part here, so the last sixth, is earned income. And this is everything from when people buy books through our system, we get a small percentage of that. When people buy these World Reader kits, that's a kit might cost $10,000 in rough terms. $10,000 is 50 e-readers, 50 cases, 50 lights, 100 books per e-reader. So that's 5,000 books. training, support, all of that. So it's a whole kind of program. It's kind of a classroom-sized program, and that's something that costs money. That's something that costs money. So this is a business. You can think of it as a segment that 2 years ago didn't exist, and this year we hope will be, roughly $300,000, business. So using the magic of algebra, you can figure out that our total budget is, is over $2 million now. And that's kind of the pie chart. Now, different organizations have very different funding strategies. Ours clearly has a number of different funding sources, and we feel pretty strongly that it's nice to have that sort of variety. That sort of what's the word I'm looking for? I guess we'll just use the word variety. Yeah, of funding sources. But other organizations have a very different strategy. They have a much more sort of monolithic strategy where they go very much only after individual donors, or maybe very much only after grant funding. But usually over time, you kind of have to have a sort of a multiplicity of funders because frankly, some of them grow. Others, grants are something that they do take a long time to come in, and so it's nice to have, kind of a baseline sort of business that you can kind of rely on a little bit more. And over time, last thing I'll say about this, I would love to create, I'd love our organization to become roughly 50-50 donor funded and revenue funded. That's sort of roughly where we want to be, but that's going to be, 5 years out or maybe more. Yeah.
So I kind of like a three-part question.
Okay.
So, are there villages in Africa where they don't have access to electricity, and where the fuel would be the most technologically advanced and most expensive item that is in the village? And if so, how would you expand to those areas? And also, once you expand, how would you address security concerns or electricity concerns?
Great questions. So the question is, are there places that don't have the electrical infrastructure? And then, if so, how do we expand into that? And what are some of the implications for security and so forth? So certainly there are, no doubt at all. Although I will tell you that the cell phone wave is, I won't say it's eliminating that problem, but it sure is addressing that problem. I mean, there's so many parts of the world, even the most remote, crazy parts of the world, 12,000 feet up in La Paz, Bolivia, where you'll see some dude with his motorcycle literally hooking up 5 different cell phones and charging them for a couple of hours, one afternoon. So access to reliable power is a problem. Access to intermittent power is less of a problem. And luckily, these e-readers only take, you can charge them for an hour and they'll last for a month. It's one of the reasons why this type of technology is actually quite well adapted for the developing world. Having said that, there are certainly plenty of parts of the world that don't have good access to power. And so what are we doing about that? We've got a whole solar initiative that's going. And actually one of the most amazing pieces of email I've gotten over the last couple of months, you talk about your highs and lows. This was a high, was from one of our donors who said, David, I was just reading a brochure about some solar stuff, and would you guys like some funding? She didn't quite say it this way, but this is how I interpret it anyway. Would you guys like some funding to explore an integrated solar solution that would work well with your e-readers? And we said, yeah, of course we would love that. And we're going back and forth with it to define what that would look like. But we have cases. In fact, sometimes I carry one around. I don't think I have one with me. But it's literally a case that goes right on the e-reader that's solar powered. You stick it in the sun, and it just keeps the thing charged. It has a little battery in it. Now, it's also one of the reasons why we're expanding into cell phones, because so many people already have cell phones that's kind of a nice thing. It's nice to be able to use a device people already have. The theft issue is fascinating for us. It was one of our single biggest worries up front. And we have now been running we have, as I say, 12,000 kids using e-readers. And honestly, our theft rate is like at the 1% level. We have in Kenya, for example, where we've now been for about 6 months with a fairly large-scale project of about 1,000 e-readers there, we've lost like 3 to theft. It's really interesting. I mean, even in Kibera, one of the biggest slums in the world, and people said, gosh, I would have never thought that this would be as successful here as it's been. Theft hasn't been a problem. And we don't really know. I mean, one of the things that people have said to us is thieves don't steal education. Okay, that's nice if that's true. Another thing people have said is, frankly, these things don't have a very high resale value. They're not as sort of alluring or as attractive as an iPod might be, or an iPad certainly. But so far, it's been one of the things we've been worried about a lot, but just haven't seen come. It doesn't mean it will never be a problem, but so far it hasn't been a big issue. But we track it very closely, very, very closely. Yeah.
So I have two questions.
Sure.
The first is sort of about like the earned income balance versus donor balance.
Yep.
So how do you feel like the world of social enterprise is moving towards? Like is there significant progress and towards becoming self-sufficient for these nonprofit companies?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is about for social enterprises balancing marketing versus like the product development, because for traditional tech companies, generally products is like really the only thing that really matters. But like obviously in social enterprise, marketing matters a lot as well, and PR. So how do you balance those?
Yeah, both really good questions. On the first question about what are sort of the trends of earned income versus donor funded? It's a very curious thing here. So there's clearly a trend towards earned income. There's no question about that, and it's obvious why. I mean, it's nice to have a reliable revenue stream that you don't have to wake up every morning and try to go ask people for money for. That's fantastic. It makes the whole thing more sustainable. Now, having said that, while there's a lot of talk about it, still, I mean, just to sort of put things in perspective for a second, like a really successful social enterprise might become a $50 million business, $50 million a year business, right? That's successful. Most of them, I mean, the vast majority never get past a couple $100,000 or maybe $1 million a year. So $50 million a year. So that's a big number in the social enterprise space. That's one Home Depot. In other words, the scale of so much social enterprise is so relatively small compared to the for-profit side that even relatively small movements towards earned income makes a big difference in the nonprofit space. But I don't think anyone can really say anyone's really cracked the code on it on a massive scale. And the big nonprofits, and I'm talking about the big guys, Save the Children or UNICEF or CARE or whatever, these are all, almost all donor funded. So I guess I'm pointing out here is that there's this sort of little bit of a disconnect between the buzz, which is go for revenue funding, and the cool success stories that people talk about. And they talk about, Warby Parker, which is, kind of a different thing, or Tom's Shoes or whatever. People talk about different sorts of blended models or for-profits that support nonprofits or whatever. And they're super, super, super cool. But at the end of the day, I have to say, it's still really, really early in that. It's really, really early. It doesn't mean it's not the right goal. It has to be the right goal because fundraising is, tiresome after a while. But it's not. I think that's an area where someone in this room might crack the code, because it's not. It really hasn't been cracked yet. Wait, what was the second part of your question?
The second question was like balancing marketing versus product for social enterprise.
Yeah, and so that's one of those things where it's not either or, it's and, and it has to be. It's true in the for-profit world. Well, in the tech world, and this is one of the big realizations that we all kind of came to, really, let's say in the late '90s, early 2000s, that it's all about the product. It's all about the customer experience. You can market it all you want, but if you don't have a great product, you don't have anything. And so just go ahead and focus 99% of your energy on creating a great thing, and that last little 1% you can focus on telling people about it if you want to. Well, in social enterprise, you don't quite have that luxury. You really don't. And one of the reasons is you have constituents in your donor base that need to hear the story. And then you also have constituents in the communities that you're serving, where often you're trying to change people's behavior. And you're asking them to think differently about the world. And so you've got to think about kind of the image you project at the same time as you think about the product you're doing. Now, having said that, I believe, and maybe this is just because of our DNA and the experience that we have, that the product and service we're creating is also incredibly important. It's why we work with FC Barcelona. It's why we go to all these publishers and say, give us not your cruddy books, but your best books, and let's figure out a way. So in other words, you've got to have a great value proposition, But the value proposition, then you do have to spend some energy thinking about how to market and how to get the word out. Otherwise, you'll have this great thing and you won't have any funding, basically. Yes. How are you?
I'm just wondering, so you're in a place like Camara, and you're giving a girl a book, and it's so wonderful, but like she said, both of her parents have passed away. She has to work to support herself. There's crime and disease and hunger all in this community. So I just wonder how you guys think about whether or not you need to think about providing wraparound services or like how you deal with the entire context of a child's life?
This is a great issue, and I think it's probably one that every nonprofit, kind of grapples with a little bit. You can't, like any organization, and you will get a chance to learn this over and over and over again in your life if you work for an organization. Any successful organization has to sort of focus at a certain point. It has to say, like, this is the problem we're trying to solve. This is the opportunity we think we're uniquely positioned to do. And so that inevitably means, well, hold on, there are all these other, adjacent issues that you really can't kind of deal with head on. And so then the question is you're asking becomes, well, how do you deal with that? Often we have other partner organizations that are also working in similar areas to ours, But to a certain extent, we've sort of almost at kind of a sort of missionary level said, we think that reading and education is just as important as health or wellness or anything like this. And so we're going to really focus. That's why we're primarily focused in schools and libraries where there is a bit of typically infrastructure around health or around nutrition or other sorts of things. And we've kind of said, what, for our own efficacy and focus, we kind of have to focus on our thing, which is books and education, and sort of partner with let other organizations kind of help with other parts of the puzzle. Now, I'll say one last thing there, which is that one of the early realizations we had is that we should not, no matter how much I love the Hardy Boys as a kid, and I did, where there is no doctor is incredibly important as well. And so some of the medical books and other sort of information we put on our program is critically important for these communities. And so, but I don't want to say that we're sort of pretending to be a kind of a health or sort of it is a bit of a different thing. It's just that we recognize we have to be part of that bigger context.
In this slide with the map and your coverage,
Yep.
There were, I think, different models, same individual's library.
Yeah.
It might, if it's not too much detail, can you briefly outline what are the different models and what are the pros and cons of those models?
Sure. So when we first started, our model was one e-reader per child in the classroom. And we wanted to go down that path because we thought it would have the biggest impact. And it was, frankly, it was sort of the gold standard. But we quickly realized, hold on, you have to be, and here this is a line from Jeff Bezos, you've got to be firm on the strategy, but you've got to be flexible on the details. If you let the details kind of obsess you, or become obsessed by the details, then you will never make any progress. And so we quickly realized that in some classroom settings and in some community settings, it was much more efficient for kids either to share e-readers. It was much more cost effective. A lot of the times the kids actually wanted to share with each other. They would share by themselves. So we would give one child an e-reader, and they would then share it with their siblings, and then we'd have to kind of go down that whole path and sort of understand what that meant for our program. So now we have a couple of different models. We have this kind of the one-to-one individual model, we call it. But we also have the classroom set model, where basically there'll be a single or two classroom quantities of e-readers that then will get shared, in the school. And then we have something called a library model, which is that literally the e-readers are in a kind of central location and people will come and they will use them and sometimes check them out or sometimes use them in place. And all three of those, I think the pros and cons are probably pretty obvious around kind of some of them are more cost effective, some of them have a faster near-term impact, but all of them, are in the service of getting more books to kids in as efficient way as we possibly can. So, good question. Let me start kind of working my way back.
So I'm very interested on metrics that can measure social impact and kind of sustainability. In your experience, what's been the most comprehensive metric for those kinds of things?
You mean for our program or at all? I'll talk about at all for a second. It's really interesting. If you hear, and I'll talk about Bill Gates for a second. If you hear Bill talk about, and by the way, I call him Bill not because he's my best friend. It's just that's what everyone calls him. Bill. Okay, so Bill, when Bill talks about this, he says, look, some things are very easy to measure. You can measure, he's got a very big focus on reducing polio deaths. And he literally wants to reduce polio deaths to 0. Okay, so that's very nice because very measurable. Like, did someone die of polio? Yes. Failure. No. Success. Ultimately, he wants to drive that to 0, and that's his stated goal in the same way that has been done with smallpox. So health metrics, particularly ones where there's this sort of 1-0 binary thing, frankly, are kind of easy to measure. And so I have to hold that up as the gold standard. You know, if you can measure something that precisely, that's wonderful. But usually in social enterprise, of course, it's not that easy, and particularly in education. You know, I mean, if you read the newspapers about the education system in the United States or what's going on in Mexico, you realize there's always an enormous amount of controversy around, you know, how do you measure the effectiveness of education? Do you measure it in the sort of narrow way or on test scores? Do you measure it in a much broader way? Do kids have better opportunities in the future, this generation they did a generation ago, and sort of everything in between? We've sort of taken kind of a middle ground. We measure these, what we call leading indicators. You know, we measure things like how many sentences, how many letters a minute can you properly decode, how many words a minute, what is your reading comprehension level? So we measure these sort of proximate, near-term leading indicators, which over time have been well correlated with more success in reading, which over time has also been correlated with higher GDP per capita. I mean, it's crazy. If you look at, you know, you can look at these sort of graphs that kind of look like this, and they chart, you know, percent literacy rate versus, you know, GDP per capita. And they lag it over 100 years. And so what they show you is that the higher, actually I've just messed up my X and my Y axis. It's the other way around. Because what they show is that the higher the literacy rate today, or let's say 100 years ago, the higher the GDP per capita is today, right? So there's a very clear correlation between those two things. But those, measuring things like literacy rates, take typically a very, very long time to measure. So, you know, as you can see, it's sort of this kind of hodgepodge. Some things are very easy to measure. That's awesome. There are other things that are not easy to measure. It makes them no less valuable. It's just they're harder to measure. And again, Bill Gates actually talks about this as a sort of fetish of measurement, which on the one hand he is a proponent of. On the other hand, he recognizes it can be very damaging because it can force people to only look at things that are measurable and ignore some other things that are equally important or things that take a longer time to measure. And so as I say, we try to take this sort of middle point of view that says, let's measure some leading indicators, but know that that's something that's going to unravel in the fullness of time. We won't really be able to measure things like literacy rates, and certainly won't be able to measure things like are kids getting into staying in school longer or getting better jobs as a result of our work until, you know, many years have elapsed. And you kind of have to be patient that way. Yeah, you in the back.
Do you ever find yourself in a position where you have to work through or around the terms or conditions of a grant, or for example, like when you're working with USAID, often that comes with a lot of baggage. So do you ever have to work through that?
So the question was, do we have to work through kind of the baggage that grants come with? And the answer is yes. We try to be careful, selective about the grants we apply for, so that we don't end up with this terrible problem of, you know, you sort of win the battle but lose the war. In other words, you win the grant, you know, but then, oh my God, you know, the cost of the grant is so high that you would have been better off not getting it in the first place. There's this notion, this is a bit of an aside, but there's this notion of inexpensive money versus expensive money. And it's not talking about the cost to get a grant, let's say. It's talking about what happens after you get the grant. How burdensome are the requirements, and how much do they risk, or do you risk contorting yourself to put yourself, you know, on the path that they want you to be on versus the path that you sort of, you know, most want to be on yourself. Anyway, that's the sort of theory. So we're lucky that we haven't found ourselves in terrible situations like that by any means. I mean, let's take Draper Richards Kaplan. Their requirements are, they do an enormous amount of due diligence. It takes them a long time. But once they give you the money, their basic requirement is they want a seat on your board, and they want to, you know, you to update them every 6 months about your progress. And that's it. So they're very enlightened as donors in that way. They basically say, look, you guys are the experts. Once we've figured out that we want to support you, we're not going to kind of get in your way. The US government is more complicated, as you can imagine. You know, those guys say, well, look, we have certain reporting requirements, but we also have certain metrics that we need you to hit. On the other hand, those are the metrics that we ourselves put out there, right? I mean, we say, look, when we apply for the grant, we say, this is what we expect to happen. Here's some changes in reading habits we expect to happen. Here's the increase in reading comprehension that we expect to see. And so to a certain extent, that's the bed that we make ourselves, and then we lie in, and that's kind of okay with us. The danger becomes if you start to chase grants or funding sources that are so far afield from your real center of gravity that then you spend all of your time trying to contort yourself to meet their requirements. But we haven't found that's not a, we haven't been tempted to go down that path. Or if we have been tempted, we've said no quickly. But it's a danger. And organizations can get themselves into trouble if they don't watch that carefully. Yeah, how about you?
It mentioned that you studied literature in college, but you later worked in Amazon and Microsoft and later World Reader. How did you jump from humanities to technology and later combine them? Did you take any programming class, or did you partner with a computer person?
Great question. So I'll tell you my work history in 1 minute, and it'll begin to kind of paint the picture. So I graduated a degree in comparative literature, as you say, but then I went to work for a consulting firm. And this was in 1987. In 1987, consulting firms were sort of all the rage. And I did that. It was it's called the LEK Partnership, a spinoff from Bain. And they were hiring people explicitly who were, and these are their words, not mine, good, smart thinkers, but not specialists in anything. So they weren't put off by the fact that I was a literature major. In fact, they actually quite liked it. And I kind of told them the whole story, which soon you guys will get to tell the same story of, liberal arts, teach you how to think, and yada yada. So, and I'd taken economics classes at Princeton and so forth. So it was not a crazy hire on their part. But anyway, so I worked in consulting. The 2 years I worked in consulting, I happened to be sort of lucky in that a number of our clients were clients that were trying to figure out, for example, which of my products are profitable for me to sell and which ones are not. In order for us to answer that question, we had to sort of build a database of the products that they were selling, and we had to sort of analyze the products based on certain characteristics, and that caused me to sort of get much more comfortable with working with computers than I'd been in the past. I also literally wrote my senior thesis, on a word processor, which today sounds like duh, but in 1987 I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. So I had this kind of interesting blend of a little bit of technology and then a little business. Then I went to business school. When I went to business school on the East Coast, great business school, and they had a strong, I ended up taking some technology courses, and then I was recruited to go work at Microsoft. And so I guess and then I worked at Microsoft for a while, and then I went over to work for Amazon. So if you kind of look at the whole thing, it's kind of bizarre. It's like comp lit all the way to Microsoft, to Amazon, to World Reader. But if you kind of connect each one kind of link by link by link, each one of them kind of kept coming back to some of my same passions and real interests around reading and business and technology. When I was a kid, I would also play with computers. My mom had an early Apple II. So I don't know if it exactly answers the question, but that's just sort of the story as I kind of wrote it for myself, is trying to take some of the things that I thought I knew something about and was passionate about and apply them to job after job after job in new ways. And that's kind of that's how it went. I'm going to go all the way over here, and then I'll work my way back around. Actually, how about you and then you?
How do you choose which books to supply?
Great question. How do we choose which books to supply? So it is a combination of what the teachers and educators ask for, and then because they typically have a list of textbooks they're already using or storybooks that they've already been using or what have you, and books that we know kids really like to read. And we have a list. We actually have a whole sort of online database you can go into, and you can see it's, as I say, about 5,000. In fact, you can even see, I'll give you a sense of it right now. This is not the whole list by any means, but it's at least a quick and easy way to let me see. If I move this over here, will that work? Ta-da! All right, this is going to be interesting. Okay, so there is Amazon. So if you go to Amazon and you type in World Reader, yeah, so that's 1,179 results. So these are all books. There's a Kenyan book, Beneath the Rainbow. There's the Canoe Story by Mishaka Sari. This is a book, and honestly, I couldn't even tell you what language that's in. This is a book by, that's a book that was donated to us. This is a book in Kiswahili, Selections of Six. That's another African book. The Girl with the Magic Hands, that's from Ghana, Fine Boys. So these are literally all books, my first time, Stories of Sex and Sexuality from Women Like You, right? So these are all West African folks. These are all books that we've digitized ourselves. So we present these books, as well as many more that are not on Amazon, to our partners, and we say basically, you pick, but here's some recommendations. And then we've leveled all the books, so we show what grade level they're appropriate for, and obviously what language they're in, what country they're from, and so forth. So it's kind of a blend. I mean, partnership. One of the ways that we've grown fairly large, fairly quickly, is we've been pretty aggressive partners with publishers and with other organizations that have let us expand our library quickly. And in this case, we let other people really help choose what those books are. And then, yeah.
Said about going from success to significance, and I was wondering if giving back was always part of your game plan, or if you just found yourself fortunate enough to be in a position where you could really make a difference.
That is a very good question. Has giving back always been part of my game plan? No, honestly. I mean, I would say the honest answer to that is I've loved what I've done at every stage of the game. And at a certain point, I sort of woke up and said, okay, I've done those things for a while. Now I want to try something really quite different. And it actually, when we were living in Barcelona, I was president of the school board that my kids went to, the school that my children went to. And before that was on a school board in Seattle of a new independent school that served underprivileged children. And so this was not the first kind of nonprofit thing I did. I sort of stepped into it by being on a board and then being president of a nonprofit board. And I'm on some other nonprofit boards. So I think it probably would have been too big a step maybe to do all at once. But over time, you just begin to realize, gosh, the world is a big and interesting place, and trying to figure out a way to participate in something bigger than you are in a new way is a sort of interesting challenge in and of itself. I think that was really it. Yeah.
I was wondering what percentage of the funds you get go directly towards your purpose or your message, and how many actually go towards the logistical running of your organization itself, and how you reconcile it to
So this is actually a very hot area. The question was, what percentage goes towards program versus what percentage goes towards kind of overhead and infrastructure and so forth. So in our case, I can repurpose my pie chart here. It's about 79% goes to program, about 21% goes to infrastructure. Now this, I have to say, this is one of the areas where if you ask different people this question, some people's heads will explode, and they will say, that question in a way presumes that there's sort of a right answer, but for different organizations, the answer might be very, very, very different. And in fact, one of the failure modes of nonprofits is it's called the nonprofit starvation cycle, where they invest so little in their infrastructure that they end up kind of falling apart. The wheels end up spinning off. And it doesn't, at first you sort of think, well, come on, how can that really happen? Well, it really can happen. And even in our organization, I mean, I will tell you, so at World Reader, one thing I haven't mentioned explicitly, but we have about 40 people who work for World Reader in total. 40. A lot of people. Now, about half of them are volunteers, about half of them are paid staff. Okay. But still, and they're in many different parts of the world. We have people in Accra, we have people in Nairobi, we have people on the East Coast of the United States, we have people in Barcelona, Spain, we have people on the West Coast, right here in the Bay Area. Our main office on the West Coast is in Hayes Valley. And then we have people up in Seattle, Washington. So we have people in many different places. Okay, that's a fairly complicated organization. My total HR department is like a half of one person, okay? That's probably too small, and it's certainly not sustainable. Over time, it's an area where I have to invest. But I, like every other person who runs a nonprofit, wants to keep the sort of the funding on kind of overhead to be as low as possible. But it's a real puzzle. It really is, to figure out what that right level is. And I can tell you, if you hear of nonprofits that say 0% goes to overhead, they're either not accounting for it correctly, or they have a nonprofit which probably in a year will disappear. The Gates Foundation, when I asked those guys, tell me what distinguishes the nonprofits, the social enterprises that you expect to be around 25 years from now versus the ones that you don't expect to be around. They say it's the ones that invest in their infrastructure that we really expect to be around for the long term. So anyway, I answered this question in this way to sort of suggest like if it were 100% overhead, that probably doesn't sound very good. Like I don't think that's a very good nonprofit. But if it's 0%, that's probably not it either. And somewhere in the sort of 15 to 30%, you can easily make an argument for anywhere in between, depending on the stage of growth and the stage of life there are. And you sort of have to dig kind of one level deeper to kind of understand what that means. So good question, really, really important issue. Listen, I'm realizing it's 5 of 6, which means I probably have time for, I will take 2 more questions. So who are the people whose questions are burning the, how can I even choose? I can't choose, so I'm going to randomly pick you there. Yes.
Oh. So, for the individual section of funding,
yeah.
Besides Bill Gates, do you feel like a lot of the people who helped you out were from your own personal connections, maybe from Microsoft and Amazon? Or did you feel like you have to really push out and contact, cold call, people just to find funding?
So the question is, were they, aside from Bill himself, but were they people that were my connections, or were they people that we didn't know? The answer is, it really is both. In my case, it started with, very much my connections, people I'd worked with at Microsoft and Amazon. Now, I mean, obviously, that's a sort of, a certain group which has been successful over time. But I don't think my story is that different from a lot of other social entrepreneurs. And I bet if you ask others who come through, they'll tell you something similar, which is you start with, people, one of the sort of truisms of giving is that people give to people they know, right? So of course, occasionally crazy things happen and people will give you a sort of a random donation that's big and they've never heard of you or they learned about you on the website. But typically, it starts with people you know. So conversely, I started by asking the people that I knew who already knew me, who knew the work that I'd done and so forth and so on. But now over time, over the last 3 to 4 years, that circle has grown quite a bit. And so now we have, as an example, that funder before. Her name is Cynthia Hammer. She's an incredible woman. She's a doctor. And she found us on the web about a year ago. And she made an unsolicited, very large $100,000 donation to us a year ago without ever having met any of us. We've subsequently met her, and now I know her fairly well. And now she's the woman who's interested in helping us do solar and so forth. But it is sort of this concentric circle where you start with the people you know, and then you tell your story a bit, and you ask people to introduce your organization to other people that they know, and then sometimes you're also just lucky, and you have to do some of it all. Oh yeah, yeah.
And that's about it. Obviously you have great talent around the room here and enthusiasm. Would you happen to have jobs, internships, or researchers, or any need for some of the resources here in front of you?
I'm glad you asked that question, Bill. Yeah, the answer is absolutely. And then I will take one last question. We started an internship program last year over the summer. It was actually I think we had one intern from Wellesley. She's now working for us full time after she graduated. This past summer, we had one other woman working for us she's a Tulane undergrad, and now she's back at Tulane. She's actually a senior this year, and she did social enterprise work. So we have, frankly, it's a fairly informal internship program, but that is, if that's of interest, then you can certainly contact me. That's really for the summer. During the school year, though, there are a couple of areas where, where we'd love some help. And some of them are on, I'll give you a couple of examples. Sort of analysis of cost structures. So one of the questions that we often get asked and we kind of grapple with is, what is the cost of your program versus other interventions, paper-based interventions and so forth? I would love some analytical help answering that question. I think it's a super interesting question. Of course, we have some data on it. We've done some research on it ourselves. But having someone or a group of people who really can sort of roll up their sleeves and kind of look at some of the other models out there and kind of understand the economics, super, super, super interesting. The data visualization side of things, who asked me about marketing versus, right, exactly. So one of the pieces of marketing we do, and it sounds kind of funny to think of this as marketing, but we do a fair amount of research, and then we try to share our research about the impact we're having. And frankly, I give us a sort of B+. in our data visualization, sort of the Edwin Tufte, how can you take large data sets of kids' progress in school and make them interesting and approachable to both sophisticated and unsophisticated people. So I have this project in my head around a data visualization group that looks at our data, at our impact data, and says, you know what, World Reader, here are 5 better ways to show your impact than the bar charts that you're using, this sort of thing. Last answer to that question might be, we've just started a program called World Reader Chapters. World Reader Chapters, one of the most consistent requests we get, and it's often from school groups, sometimes undergraduate school groups, sometimes business school groups, sometimes even high school groups and even younger, is can we start a student club that raises money for one of your programs and then helps support a World Reader kit, basically, in one of the schools so that we can kind of see end-to-end the whole process, everything from the fundraising piece all the way to literally boxing the e-readers up and sending them to, and putting the books on it and then sending them to Africa and then seeing what the impact is and kind of being able to try to track that. I've mentioned a couple times I have 2 daughters. I will tell you, my own daughter, a couple of weeks ago, she's in high school still, she just started a World Reader Club at her school last week. She has 38 kids in that club, and they are raising money for a World Reader kit. And she, in fact, just today had a bake sale for it and is going to do that. So that's at the sort of the high school level, but it can be done at the college level. And so if you're interested in starting a World Reader chapter, gosh, I would love that. I think it's an incredibly interesting way to sort of roll up your sleeves, raise money, of course, because that's, frankly, we need that, but also kind of see it end to end. And the person who heads that program up is named Susan, and her address is susan@worldreader.org, and I am David at worldreader.org. I get an enormous amount of email, so I will tell you right now, if you send me email and I don't respond, it's just because I get a lot of email, but please do it again. All right, listen, I promise to answer one last question, and I will raise, whoever has his or her hand raised the highest. you, just because you're sitting higher. It's not fair, I know.
So my question is, or there are kind of 2 questions. The first is, have you considered like an update cycle for the technology as it ages? And then tying along with that, the Kindle in specific has gained a lot of new capabilities in the last few years. And have you considered creating like educational peripherals or curricula associated with these textbooks you make available that use like the internet or the apps that are available?
We absolutely, I'll answer the second half of the question, and the first half, let's talk about that afterwards. And then anyone else who has a question, I'm happy to be around as long as you want and answer questions. The answer to the second question really is yes. And in fact, even today, we've started to take advantage of some of the interactive capabilities. You can do basic flashcards and so forth on Kindles. And we've got some publishers that have given us their material, and we've kind of worked with them to sort of up their game a little bit. In the long term, we want to eradicate illiteracy. That's what we want to do. And so we want to use all the tools at our disposal. And we have this vision, and this is going to be many years down the road, where someday we're going to have a lot of information about how these devices get used in the developing world. And we sort of want to work with somebody who wants to create, the World Reader version of this device and kind of bake in a lot of the capabilities that we've learned about over the last, bunch of years. We're still sort of super early days there, so right now we're kind of experimenting in that and doing, as I say, simple things with flashcards and other educational tools. These aren't incredibly powerful. It's one of the reasons they last for a month on a single charge. But they get, as you say, they get better all the time. You all, thank you so much for all your interest, all your questions. I really appreciate it. Yeah, of course.